In the winter of 1847, when the first blizzards began to claim lives across the Tennessee mountains, something unthinkable happened in the isolated valley of Millbrook. While neighboring settlements struggled with famine, disease, and the brutal reality of frontier life, one family not only survived, they thrived. The Whitmore sisters, 7 women whose beauty was matched only by the growing whispers about their impossible secret. They never seemed to age a single day. This is not a story about miracles. This is a story about the darkest bargain ever struck on American soil. A pact so ancient and so terrifying that it would take nearly 2 centuries for anyone to uncover the truth. What you're about to hear was buried in classified government documents, hidden in the archives of a disbanded federal investigation unit, and sealed away because the implications were too dangerous for the public to know. The truth is that the Whitmore sisters didn't just cheat death, they fed it. And the price they paid, the price their entire community paid, reveals a pattern of supernatural predation that may still be active today. This investigation will show you how 7 women used an ancient ritual to achieve immortality, how they systematically harvested the life force of their neighbors for over 60 years, and how their eventual exposure led to one of the most covered-up massacres in American history. But here's what makes this case truly terrifying. We have evidence that suggests their methods have been replicated, that somewhere, in hidden corners of our modern world, new covens of ageless women are continuing this harvest. The Whitmore sisters weren't unique. They were the prototype. Welcome to the most dangerous story we've ever investigated. And if you're brave enough to hear the complete truth, if you want to understand how immortality was achieved through mass murder, then stay with us. Because by the end of this investigation, you'll understand why the government tried so hard to bury this story, and why they might still be watching anyone who dares to uncover it. The Valley of Millbrook, Tennessee, was settled in 1823 by a group of families fleeing the economic collapse in the eastern states. They were desperate people seeking a fresh start in the unforgiving wilderness. Among these original settlers was Jeremiah Whitmore, a widower with 7 daughters ranging in age from 16 to 28. What made the Whitmore family immediately noteworthy wasn't just their obvious prosperity. Jeremiah had somehow managed to transport substantial wealth into the wilderness, but the extraordinary beauty of his daughters. Each sister was said to possess an otherworldly perfection that made travelers stop and stare. They moved with an unnatural grace, spoke with voices like crystalline bells, and had skin so flawless it seemed to glow in candlelight. But it was their eyes that people remembered most. Deep, ancient eyes that seemed far too knowing for their apparent age. Eyes that suggested they had seen things no young woman should ever witness. The eldest sister, Morgana, served as the unofficial leader of the family. She was the one who conducted business with the outside world, who negotiated trades, and who seemed to know things about people that she had no right to know. Visitors to their expansive homestead often left feeling unsettled, as if Morgana could peer directly into their souls and catalog their deepest fears and desires. The other sisters, Cordelia, Seraphina, Isabella, Evangeline, Persephone, and the youngest, Lilith, each had their own particular talents. Cordelia was said to have an uncanny ability to predict weather patterns years in advance. Seraphina could heal any ailment with her touch, but only if the patient paid her specific price. Isabella possessed knowledge of herbal remedies that seemed to come from no earthly source. Evangeline could find lost objects and missing people with supernatural accuracy. Persephone had an encyclopedia knowledge of every family's genealogy going back generations. And Lilith, barely 18 when they arrived, could allegedly see the exact moment of anyone's death just by touching them. These abilities made the sisters invaluable to the struggling community, but they also made them deeply unsettling. People began to notice patterns. Those who received Seraphina's healing often seemed to age rapidly in the following months. Families who consulted Evangeline about missing relatives would sometimes find those relatives, but they would be found dead, apparently having died at the exact moment they'd consulted her. And anyone who allowed Lilith to touch them would become obsessed with death, often taking their own lives within a year. But the most disturbing pattern was this. While everyone else in Millbrook aged normally, bearing the harsh marks of frontier life. The Whitmore sisters remained exactly the same. Year after year, decade after decade, they looked precisely as they had the day they arrived. By 1847, nearly 25 years after their arrival, the oldest sister should have been in her 50s. Instead, Morgana still appeared to be a woman of 28, with not a single gray hair or line on her face. The community's growing unease was amplified by the fact that the Whitmore homestead seemed to exist in its own microclimate of prosperity. Their crops never failed, their livestock never sickened, their house never needed repairs. While their neighbors struggled with the basic challenges of survival, the sisters lived in a state of perpetual abundance that defied all logic. It was during the winter of 1847, when a particularly brutal blizzard trapped the entire valley for 3 months, that people began to die, not from starvation or cold, as one might expect, but from a mysterious wasting disease that seemed to drain the life out of its victims. They would become listless, lose weight rapidly, and age decades in a matter of weeks before finally passing away. The disease was selective. It only struck certain families, and always seemed to target the strongest, healthiest members first. Thomas Clearwater, the valley's only doctor, was baffled. He had never seen anything like it. The victims' bodies showed no signs of conventional illness. Their organs were healthy, their blood appeared normal, yet they simply faded away. It was as if some invisible force was systematically draining their vital essence. The breakthrough came when Dr. Clearwater noticed something that chilled him to the bone. Every family that lost members to the wasting disease had recently received some form of help from the Whitmore sisters. Serafina had treated a sick child, and within weeks, the child's parents and siblings began to waste away. Evangeline had helped locate a lost heirloom, and shortly after, the eldest son of that family, started to deteriorate. Isabella had provided an herbal remedy for a woman's arthritis, and soon the woman's entire household was showing signs of the mysterious ailment. Dr. Clearwater began to keep detailed records, cross-referencing every interaction between the sisters and the affected families. The pattern became undeniable. The Whitmore sisters weren't just immune to the wasting disease, they were its source. Somehow, their help was functioning as a conduit, allowing them to slowly drain the life force from their victims while maintaining their own unnatural vitality. But Dr. Clearwater's investigation was about to uncover something far more horrifying than a supernatural plague. Hidden in the oldest church records, in documents that predated the sisters' arrival in Millbrook, he found references to a similar mysterious family in a settlement in North Carolina. 7 sisters who never aged, who provided miraculous help to their community, and who left behind a trail of inexplicably deceased neighbors. The records described their sudden disappearance in 1822, just 1 year before the Whitmore sisters appeared in Tennessee. The implications were staggering. The Whitmore sisters weren't just immortal, they were nomadic predators, moving from community to community, establishing themselves as helpful neighbors while systematically harvesting the life force of entire populations. They would stay in one location for 20 to 30 years, long enough to drain it of vitality, and then move on to fresh hunting grounds. Dr. Clearwater's research revealed an even more disturbing pattern. In every location the sisters had inhabited, the historical records showed the same sequence of events: initial prosperity for the community, followed by a period of mysterious deaths among the healthiest residents, and finally a complete demographic collapse. Entire bloodlines would simply disappear from the records, with no explanation for their fate. But the most chilling discovery was yet to come. Dr. Clearwater found evidence that the sisters weren't working alone. Buried in genealogical records, he discovered that in each community they inhabited, they would identify and recruit certain local women, always 7 in number, to serve as their assistants or apprentices. These women would gradually begin to exhibit the same ageless characteristics as their mentors. They were creating new covens, expanding their network of supernatural predators across the frontier. In Millbrook, Dr. Clearwater identified the 7 women who had been spending increasing amounts of time at the Whitmore homestead: Sarah Fletcher, the blacksmith's daughter; Mary Donovan, a widow with no living relatives; Elizabeth Preston, a young woman who had been engaged to be married until her fiancé mysteriously died. Catherine Mills, the pastor's rebellious daughter. Rebecca Stone, a midwife whose patients increasingly suffered complications. Jessica Hartwell, an unmarried woman approaching 30 who was desperate to avoid becoming a spinster. And finally, Agnes Blackwood, a woman whose husband and children had all died in what was ruled an accidental fire. All 7 of these women had experienced significant trauma or desperation before being drawn into the sisters' circle. Dr. Clearwater realized this was part of the pattern. The sisters specifically targeted women who were vulnerable, isolated, or motivated by grief or fear. They offered these women a solution to their problems: eternal youth, supernatural abilities, and freedom from the constraints of mortal life. All they had to do was participate in the harvest. The recruitment process was insidious. It began with simple acts of kindness. The sisters would provide comfort, advice, or practical help during times of crisis. Gradually, they would introduce these women to increasingly esoteric practices, meditation sessions that lasted for hours, herbal remedies that induced strange visions, rituals performed under the full moon that left participants feeling intoxicated with power. And finally, the ultimate test: participation in the life-draining process itself. Dr. Clearwater's investigation revealed that the new recruits weren't just witnesses to the sisters' supernatural feeding. They were active participants. The process required multiple conduits to efficiently drain life force from an entire community. Each woman in the coven would form psychic connections with specific families, slowly siphoning their vitality over months or years. The sisters had created a network of supernatural parasites that could harvest the life essence of hundreds of people simultaneously. But Dr. Clearwater had made a fatal error in his investigation. He had been too obvious, too direct in his questioning. The sisters had been watching him, and they had realized that their secret was in danger of being exposed. What happened next would become the foundation for one of the most elaborate government cover-ups in American history. On the night of March 15, 1848, Dr. Clearwater was found dead in his study, apparently having suffered a heart attack while working at his desk. But the circumstances of his death were impossible to explain. He was only 35 years old, in perfect health, and showed no signs of heart disease. More disturbing still, his body appeared to have aged decades overnight. His hair had turned completely white, his skin was deeply wrinkled, and his body was emaciated as if he had been starving for months. All of his research, his journals, his medical records, everything related to his investigation of the Whitmore sisters, had vanished. His office had been methodically searched, and every piece of evidence had been removed with surgical precision. The only thing left behind was a single note, written in an elegant feminine hand. Some truths are too dangerous for mortal minds to contain. The death of Dr. Clearwater sent a wave of terror through Millbrook. People began to understand that they were not dealing with merely unusual neighbors. They were trapped in a valley with supernatural predators who would kill anyone who threatened their operation. Families began to pack their belongings and prepare to flee, but they quickly discovered that leaving Millbrook had become impossible. Every attempt to exit the valley ended in disaster. Wagons would break down miles from any settlement. Horses would suddenly go lame. Travelers would become hopelessly lost in terrain they had navigated successfully for years. And those who did manage to leave the valley would invariably return within days, their memories mysteriously altered, claiming they had simply changed their minds about departing. The sisters had created a supernatural prison, trapping their prey within the valley while they completed their harvest. The community that had once numbered nearly 300 souls was systematically being drained of life, and there was no escape. But unknown to the sisters, Dr. Clearwater had taken one crucial precaution before his death. He had sent a detailed letter to his mentor, Dr. Samuel Morrison, who worked for the federal government's newly formed Department of Unusual Phenomena, a classified agency tasked with investigating supernatural threats to national security. Dr. Clearwater's letter contained copies of his most damning evidence, including genealogical charts that traced the sisters' movements across multiple states and detailed descriptions of their life-draining abilities. Dr. Morrison immediately recognized the threat posed by the Whitmore sisters. If they were indeed creating new covens of immortal predators, they represented an existential threat to the expanding American frontier. Entire regions could be systematically depopulated by these supernatural parasites, and the government would be powerless to stop them using conventional means. Dr. Morrison assembled a team of specialists, military officers trained in unconventional warfare, scholars of ancient occult practices, and scientists equipped with experimental technologies designed to detect and combat supernatural phenomena. Their mission was simple: travel to Millbrook, document the sisters' capabilities, and eliminate the threat by any means necessary. The team arrived in the valley in April 1848, posing as a geological survey expedition. What they found exceeded their worst fears. Millbrook had become a necropolis disguised as a thriving community. The streets were filled with people going about their daily routines, but these were not the original settlers. They were animated corpses, their bodies sustained by the sisters, magic, but their souls long since consumed. The real residents of Millbrook, those who had not yet been completely drained, were held in a state of supernatural paralysis, trapped in their own bodies while their life force was slowly harvested. They could see, hear, and think, but they could not speak, move, or resist. They were conscious prisoners in their own flesh, forced to watch as their strength, their memories, and their very essence were stolen day by day. At the center of this horror were the 14 women who comprised the expanded coven. The original Whitmore sisters had successfully recruited their 7 apprentices, creating a network of supernatural predators capable of sustaining themselves indefinitely by feeding on human life force. They had transformed Millbrook into their personal feeding ground, a laboratory where they could perfect their harvesting techniques and experiment with new methods of life extension. But the sisters had made one critical error. They had grown overconfident, believing themselves to be invulnerable to any mortal threat. They had not anticipated that the federal government possessed knowledge of ancient binding rituals, weapons forged from meteoric iron, and scientific instruments capable of detecting psychic energy. The confrontation that followed would determine whether America's frontier would fall to supernatural predators, or whether humanity would find a way to fight back against forces older than civilization itself. The government's specialized team spent 3 weeks in Millbrook, carefully documenting the sisters' capabilities while searching for a weakness in their supernatural defenses. What they discovered would change everything they thought they knew about the nature of life, death, and the hidden forces that shaped human destiny. Dr. Morrison's investigation revealed that the sisters' immortality was not simply a matter of draining life force from their victims. They had tapped into something far more fundamental, a primordial energy source that existed beneath the fabric of reality itself. The life force they stole from their victims was merely a conduit, a way of accessing this deeper wellspring of power. The sisters had discovered the location of what ancient texts referred to as a font of eternity, a geographical point where the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of pure energy became permeable. These fonts were incredibly rare, occurring perhaps once every few hundred miles, and they were the source of all supernatural power on Earth. By establishing their homestead directly above this font, the sisters had gained access to unlimited energy. But the font required a specific type of activation. It needed to be fed a constant stream of human consciousness, memories, and emotional energy. The sisters had learned to harvest these intangible elements from their victims, using them to keep the font active and maintain their connection to immortality. The process was incredibly sophisticated. The sisters didn't simply kill their victims, they slowly dissolved their consciousness over months or years, extracting every memory, every emotion, every thought, and feeding it into the font. This is why their victims aged so rapidly. They weren't just losing physical vitality, they were losing the accumulated experiences that made them human. But Dr. Morrison's team discovered something even more terrifying. The sisters weren't just using the font to sustain themselves, they were using it to create new fonts. By sacrificing enough human consciousness to the original font, they could establish satellite locations with similar properties. This explained how they had been able to move from community to community while maintaining their immortality. They were building a network of supernatural power sources across the American frontier. The implications were staggering. If the sisters were allowed to continue their work, they could eventually establish fonts in every major population center. They could create an infrastructure of supernatural predation that would allow covens of immortal women to control and harvest the entire human population. America itself could become a vast feeding ground for ageless supernatural predators. But the investigation also revealed the sisters' one critical vulnerability. The font required constant maintenance through human sacrifice. If the flow of consciousness into the font were interrupted for more than a few days, the connection would begin to weaken. If it were interrupted for more than a week, the font would go dormant, cutting off the sisters' access to supernatural power and leaving them vulnerable to conventional weapons. Dr. Morrison realized that they had one chance to stop the sisters before they completed their transformation of Millbrook and moved on to their next hunting ground. They would have to simultaneously rescue the remaining human victims, those who were still alive but trapped in supernatural paralysis, and cut off the sisters' access to the font. It would require perfect timing, superior firepower, and a willingness to risk everything on a single coordinated assault. The plan was audacious and desperate. Dr. Morrison's team would split into 3 groups. The first group would use experimental electromagnetic devices to disrupt the psychic connections between the sisters and their victims, hopefully freeing the trapped humans from their supernatural paralysis. The second group would assault the Whitmore homestead directly, using weapons forged from meteoric iron, one of the few substances that could harm supernatural entities. The third group would locate and destroy the font itself, using explosives specifically designed to disrupt energy fields. But as they prepared for their assault, Dr. Morrison's team made one final, terrifying discovery. The sisters had not been idle during the weeks of surveillance. They had detected the government investigation and had begun accelerating their harvesting process. They were attempting to drain the remaining life force from Millbrook's population in a single massive sacrifice that would grant them enough power to establish fonts across multiple states simultaneously. If they succeeded, the American frontier would fall to supernatural predation within a generation. The race to stop the Whitmore sisters had become a race to save the soul of a nation. The assault on the Whitmore homestead began at midnight on May 3, 1848. Dr. Morrison's team had spent days preparing for what they knew would be either the salvation of the American frontier or the beginning of a supernatural war that humanity was destined to lose. What they discovered during that blood-soaked night would forever change how the federal government approached supernatural threats. The first phase of the operation seemed to proceed according to plan. The electromagnetic devices, crude by modern standards but revolutionary for their time, successfully disrupted the psychic connections binding the surviving residents of Millbrook. Across the valley, men and women who had been trapped in supernatural paralysis for months suddenly found themselves able to move, speak, and think clearly. Their first coherent thoughts were screams of absolute terror. What these liberated victims revealed was far worse than Dr. Morrison's team had anticipated. The sisters hadn't simply been draining their life force, they had been conducting experiments on human consciousness itself. They had learned to extract and manipulate specific memories, emotions, and personality traits from their victims. Some residents had been forced to live the same traumatic day over and over again. Their consciousness reset each morning while their bodies continued to age. Others had been stripped of all positive emotions, leaving them in a state of perpetual despair that made their life force easier to harvest. But the most horrifying discovery was this: the sisters had been breeding their victims, not physically, but psychologically. They had been creating artificial personalities within their prisoners, minds, splitting single consciousness into multiple entities that could be harvested separately. A farmer who had lived in Millbrook for 20 years might contain within his mind the manufactured consciousness of 10 different people, each with their own memories, fears, and dreams, all of which could be fed to the font. Sarah Fletcher, the blacksmith's daughter who had been recruited into the sisters' coven, revealed the full extent of their operation as government agents found her in the homestead's basement. She was no longer entirely human. Her body had been modified through supernatural means. her nervous system rewired to serve as a living conduit for psychic energy. But unlike the original sisters, she retained enough of her humanity to feel horror at what she had become. Through tears of blood, her tear ducts had been altered to process the psychic energy that flowed through her body. Sarah described the recruitment process from the inside. The sisters didn't simply offer immortality to their new recruits. They systematically destroyed their humanity first, breaking down their psychological defenses through a combination of supernatural manipulation and calculated psychological torture. The process began with isolation. Potential recruits would find their families and friends mysteriously avoiding them, their romantic relationships failing for inexplicable reasons, their professional prospects drying up overnight. The sisters would orchestrate these failures through subtle manipulation of probability and circumstance, leaving their targets desperate and alone. Next came the seduction phase. The sisters would appear as caring mentors, offering comfort and understanding to their isolated targets. They would provide solutions to every problem, answers to every question, and gradual introduction to powers that made ordinary human existence seem pathetic by comparison. The targets would be given small tastes of supernatural ability, the power to influence others, or emotions, to see glimpses of the future, to heal minor ailments with a touch. But each use of these abilities required payment in the form of human consciousness. At first, the sisters would provide this consciousness themselves, drawing from their vast stores of harvested mental energy. But gradually, the new recruits would be required to contribute their own memories, their own emotional experiences, their own sense of identity. They would feed parts of themselves to the font, piece by piece, until very little of their original personality remained. The final stage was the most insidious. Once the recruits had been sufficiently hollowed out, the sisters would rebuild them according to their own specifications. They would implant new memories, new emotional responses, new loyalties. The person who emerged from this process would believe themselves to be the same individual, but they would be fundamentally transformed, a puppet controlled by supernatural forces beyond their comprehension. Sarah Fletcher had retained just enough of her original personality to understand what had been done to her, and the knowledge was driving her insane. She begged Dr. Morrison's agents to kill her, to end her existence before she was forced to participate in any more harvesting. But her pleas were interrupted by a sound that froze the blood of everyone in the basement, the sound of footsteps approaching from above. The sisters had returned from their midnight ritual, and they were not pleased to find intruders in their domain. What happened next defied every principle of physics and biology that Dr. Morrison's team thought they understood. The 7 Whitmore sisters descended into the basement, but they were no longer entirely physical beings. They seemed to exist partially in this reality and partially in some other dimension, where the normal rules of existence didn't apply. Morgana, the eldest sister, appeared as a shifting mass of shadow and starlight, her form constantly changing as if she were made of liquid darkness that occasionally coalesced into the shape of a beautiful woman. When she spoke, her voice came from everywhere and nowhere, seeming to originate from inside the listeners' minds rather than from any physical source. "You have disrupted the harvest," she said, her words carrying layers of meaning that burrowed into the consciousness of everyone present. "You have stolen what belongs to us. The debt must be paid." Dr. Morrison tried to respond, but found that he could not speak. None of his team could move or make a sound. The sisters' mere presence had induced a form of supernatural paralysis that was far more powerful than anything they had encountered before. They could only watch in horror as the sisters began to demonstrate their true capabilities. Cordelia, the sister with power over weather patterns, gestured casually toward the ceiling. Instantly, the temperature in the basement dropped by 40 degrees. Frost began to form on the walls, and the breath of the government agents became visible in puffing clouds. But this was not ordinary cold. It was the cold of absolute zero, the temperature at which molecular motion ceases entirely. The agents should have frozen to death within seconds, but the sisters were keeping them alive through sheer force of will, allowing them to experience the cold without succumbing to it. Serafina, the healer, placed her hand on the forehead of one of the government agents, a young lieutenant named Marcus Webb. To the horrified observers, it appeared that she was healing him, but the reality was far more terrifying. She was accelerating his healing processes to an impossible degree, causing his body to repair itself so rapidly that it began to overproduce cells. Tumors began forming under his skin, growing and shrinking in a grotesque cycle of uncontrolled cellular reproduction. Isabella, the herbalist, opened her mouth and exhaled a cloud of spores that should not have been able to exist in the earthly realm. These spores invaded the respiratory systems of the government agents, but instead of causing disease, they began to rewrite their genetic code in real time. The agents could feel their DNA being altered, their cellular structure being modified according to Isabella's will. Evangeline, who could find lost objects and people, demonstrated her power by reaching into the mind of Dr. Morrison himself. She extracted his most precious memory, the moment he had first held his newborn daughter, and held it suspended in the air before him like a glowing orb of light. She then began to systematically dismantle the memory, pulling apart each component and showing him how easily she could destroy not just his recollection of that moment, but the emotional significance it held for him. Persephone, the genealogist, began reciting the complete family histories of every government agent present, going back 20 generations. But she wasn't just recounting their ancestry. She was showing them how she could alter it. She demonstrated that she could retroactively change their bloodlines, erasing certain ancestors from existence and replacing them with others, fundamentally altering their genetic inheritance and even their physical appearance. Lilith, the youngest sister who could see the moment of anyone's death, touched each government agent in turn and described in precise detail how and when they would die. But then she revealed something even more terrifying. She could change those death dates at will. She could extend their lives for centuries or end them within the next minute, depending on her whim. But it was Morgana who demonstrated the most terrifying power of all. She reached into the psychic space where human consciousness resided and began to extract the agent's sense of individual identity. One by one, the government agents began to forget who they were. Their names, their personal histories, their relationships with other people. All of it began to fade away until they existed as conscious beings without any sense of self. "This is what we offer to humanity," Morgana explained as her victims struggled to remember their own names. "Freedom from the burden of individual existence. Release from the pain of personal identity. We can consume your consciousness and transform it into something greater than the sum of its parts." She gestured toward the walls of the basement, and the agents saw that they were not made of stone and wood as they had initially appeared. The walls were composed of human faces, thousands upon thousands of them, all perfectly preserved in expressions of absolute serenity. These were the consciousness of everyone the sisters had ever harvested, integrated into the structure of their home, and serving as living building materials. Each face you see represents a person who has been liberated from the limitations of individual existence. Morgana continued. They are no longer trapped within the narrow confines of a single lifetime, a single perspective, a single identity. They have become part of something eternal and infinitely more meaningful than their original selves. But as Morgana spoke, Dr. Morrison noticed something that gave him hope. Sarah Fletcher, the blacksmith's daughter who had been partially transformed into a psychic conduit, was still present in the basement. And despite her modification, she was managing to resist the sisters' influence to a degree that the government agents could not. Her hybrid nature, part human, part supernatural entity, seemed to provide her with some protection against their most devastating attacks. More importantly, Dr. Morrison realized that the sisters' demonstration of power was actually weakening them. Every supernatural ability they displayed required them to draw energy from the font beneath the homestead. And because the government's electromagnetic devices were still disrupting psychic connections throughout the valley, the sisters were having to work much harder than usual to maintain their abilities. Dr. Morrison focused all of his willpower on a single thought: the location of the font. If his team could destroy the energy source that powered the sisters' abilities, they might have a chance to defeat these seemingly invincible entities. But he needed to communicate this information to his team without the sisters detecting his intentions. The solution came from an unexpected source. Sarah Fletcher, despite her supernatural modifications, still retained enough humanity to understand the situation. Using the psychic abilities she had gained through her transformation, she began to transmit Dr. Morrison's thoughts to the other government agents without the sisters' knowledge. Her hybrid nature allowed her to operate on the same psychic frequency as the sisters while remaining undetected. Through Sarah's psychic relay, Dr. Morrison was able to coordinate a desperate counterattack. The plan was simple but incredibly dangerous. They would simultaneously overload all of their electromagnetic devices, creating a massive psychic disruption that would temporarily sever the sisters' connection to the font. In that brief window of vulnerability, they would detonate the explosive charges they had placed around the homestead's foundation, hoping to damage the font itself. But the plan required Sarah to make the ultimate sacrifice. To generate enough psychic interference to disrupt the sisters' abilities, she would have to channel all of her life force through the electromagnetic devices at once. The process would kill her, but it might provide the distraction necessary for the government agents to complete their mission. Sarah Fletcher, the young woman who had been manipulated and transformed by the sisters' influence, who had been turned into a living conduit for supernatural energy, made a choice that would echo through history. She chose humanity over immortality, mortality over eternal servitude, sacrifice over self-preservation. As the sisters continued their supernatural torture of the government agents, reveling in their demonstration of power, Sarah began to channel every ounce of her modified life force into the electromagnetic devices. The result was a psychic explosion that shattered the supernatural defenses of the homestead and temporarily severed the sisters' connection to their power source. For the first time in decades, the Whitmore sisters were vulnerable to conventional weapons. Dr. Morrison and his team didn't waste the opportunity. Even as Sarah Fletcher's body crumbled to dust, the price of her heroic sacrifice, the government agents opened fire with their meteoric iron bullets. The sisters, caught off guard by their sudden vulnerability, were struck multiple times before they could retreat to the upper levels of the homestead. But mortally wounding supernatural entities was not the same as killing them. Even with meteoric iron bullets lodged in their bodies, the sisters retained enough power to begin a fighting retreat toward the font chamber located beneath the homestead's foundation. If they could reach their power source and re-establish their connection to it, they would be able to heal their wounds and resume their assault on the government forces. The chase through the Whitmore homestead was a nightmare of shifting reality and supernatural horror. As the wounded sisters fled toward their sanctuary, they warped the architecture of their home to confuse and trap their pursuers. Staircases led to dead ends, doorways opened onto solid walls, and rooms rearranged themselves according to principles of geometry that human minds were not equipped to understand. Dr. Morrison's team found themselves lost in a maze that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. They would enter a room on the ground floor and find themselves on the second floor. They would walk down a hallway that should have led east and discover they were now facing west. The homestead had become a supernatural fortress that defied every law of physics. But the sisters had made a critical error in their retreat. In their desperation to reach the font, they had begun drawing power from it without establishing proper control over the energy flow. The font beneath the homestead began to destabilize, releasing raw supernatural energy that warped reality in increasingly unpredictable ways. The walls of the homestead began to bleed a substance that was not quite blood and not quite shadow. The faces of the harvested victims embedded in the structure began to speak, their voices creating a cacophony of whispered warnings and pleas for release. The air itself became thick and viscous, making movement difficult and breathing laborious. Most disturbing of all, the boundary between life and death began to break down within the homestead. The government agents began to see the ghosts of the sisters, victims, not as peaceful spirits, but as tortured entities trapped in an eternal state of partial existence. These spectral beings were neither fully alive nor completely dead, existing in a liminal state that was profoundly unnatural. The ghosts began to attack both the government agents and the sisters themselves, apparently unable to distinguish between the living and their supernatural tormentors. They clawed at any conscious being they encountered, desperate to drain life force that might allow them to fully cross over into death or return to life. The homestead became a battlefield where the living, the dead, and the undying fought a three-way war for the right to exist. It was in this chaos that Dr. Morrison finally located the entrance to the font chamber, hidden behind a bookshelf in what had appeared to be the homestead's library. A staircase descended into the earth itself. The stairs were carved from some black stone that seemed to absorb light, and the air rising from below carried a scent that was simultaneously nauseating and intoxicating. As Dr. Morrison and his remaining team members descended toward the font, they could hear the sisters somewhere ahead of them, chanting in a language that predated any human civilization. The words themselves seemed to have physical weight, pressing down on the listeners and making each step more difficult than the last. The font chamber, when they finally reached it, exceeded their worst expectations. The room was vast, far larger than the homestead above could possibly contain. The walls were covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, geometric patterns that seemed to move and shift when viewed peripherally. And at the center of the chamber was the font itself. The font was not a fountain or a pool, as Dr. Morrison had imagined. It was a rift in reality itself, a tear in the fabric of existence through which raw energy from some other dimension poured into the earthly realm. The energy was visible as a writhing mass of colors that had no names, patterns of light that caused physical pain to observe, and sounds that could be felt as much as heard. The seven sisters stood before the font in a circle, their bodies partially translucent as they began to merge with the energy flowing from the rift. They were attempting to transform themselves into pure supernatural entities, abandoning their physical forms entirely in order to become immortal forces of nature rather than immortal women. Dr. Morrison realized that if the sisters completed their transformation, they would become virtually indestructible. As energy beings, they would be immune to any physical weapon, capable of existing in multiple locations simultaneously, and able to establish new fonts wherever they chose. They would become a plague of supernatural predation that could spread across the entire world. The government agents had one chance to stop the transformation. The explosive charges they had placed around the homestead's foundation were designed to disrupt energy fields, and if detonated inside the font chamber, they might be able to collapse the rift and trap the sisters in their partially transformed state. But someone would have to remain in the chamber to manually detonate the charges, ensuring they were positioned correctly for maximum effect. It would be a suicide mission, as the explosion would certainly kill anyone within the chamber when it occurred. Dr. Morrison looked at his remaining team members. Only 3 agents had survived the journey through the transformed homestead, and saw his own grim determination reflected in their faces. They had signed up to protect America from supernatural threats, and this was the ultimate test of their commitment. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, still bearing the supernatural tumors that Serafina had inflicted on him, volunteered to stay behind. His body was already dying from the cellular damage he had suffered, and he would likely succumb to his wounds within hours regardless. At least this way, his death would serve a purpose. As Dr. Morrison and the other surviving agents retreated toward the staircase, Lieutenant Webb began positioning the explosive charges around the font. The sisters, so focused on their transformation that they barely seemed aware of his presence, continued their chanting as energy from the rift flowed through their increasingly translucent bodies. But as Webb prepared to detonate the charges, one of the sisters, Lilith, the youngest, suddenly turned toward him. Her eyes, now glowing with supernatural fire, met his gaze, and she spoke in a voice that seemed to come from the font itself. "You cannot destroy us, mortal. We are becoming eternal. We are becoming inevitable. Even if you collapse this font, there are others. Even if you kill these bodies, we will find new ones. The harvest will continue, in this century or the next, in this dimension or another. Humanity will serve as our sustenance until the stars themselves burn out." Webb smiled grimly as he placed his hand on the detonation trigger. "Maybe so," he replied, "but not today." The explosion that followed was unlike anything that had ever occurred on Earth. The combination of conventional explosives and supernatural energy created a blast that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The font collapsed in on itself, creating a vortex that began pulling everything in the chamber toward a single point of infinite density. The seven sisters, caught in the middle of their transformation, were torn apart by forces they had spent centuries learning to control. Their consciousness, partially merged with the font's energy, was scattered across multiple realities as the rift sealed itself. They were not killed. Entities of their power could not simply die, but they were dispersed, fragmented, and banished to realms where they would need centuries to reconstitute themselves. The homestead above collapsed into the chamber as the foundation gave way, burying the font beneath tons of rubble and earth. The supernatural energy that had sustained the sisters' operation dissipated, returning Millbrook to the normal flow of time and causality. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Lieutenant Webb was vaporized in the explosion, his sacrifice saving not just the residents of Millbrook, but potentially the entire American frontier. Dr. Morrison and his two surviving agents were blown clear of the collapsing homestead, but they were forever changed by their exposure to supernatural forces beyond human comprehension. The immediate aftermath of the explosion was chaos. The surviving residents of Millbrook, suddenly freed from the sisters' influence, found themselves struggling to remember who they were and what had happened to them. Many had lost months or years of memories to the harvesting process. Others retained clear recollections of their torment, but found that no one would believe their accounts of supernatural predation. Dr. Morrison, despite his injuries, began the delicate process of managing the situation. The federal government could not allow knowledge of the sisters' operation to become public. The implications were too frightening, the potential for panic too great. An elaborate cover story was constructed. A gas leak had caused an explosion that destroyed the Whitmore homestead and claimed several lives. The surviving residents were relocated to different parts of the country and provided with new identities to prevent them from comparing their experiences and reconstructing the truth. But Dr. Morrison knew that the threat had not been permanently eliminated. Lilith's final words haunted him. Even if you collapse this font, there are others. His investigation into the sisters' background had revealed evidence of multiple supernatural energy sources scattered across the American continent. And if the Whitmore sisters had known about these locations, it was likely that other entities did as well. The Department of Unusual Phenomena, operating in absolute secrecy, began a systematic search for other fonts and the supernatural predators that might be exploiting them. What they discovered would form the foundation for a hidden war that continues to this day. A war between humanity and forces that view human consciousness as nothing more than a renewable resource to be harvested and consumed. The story of the Whitmore sisters was classified at the highest levels of government and buried in archives that officially do not exist. But the pattern they established, the recruitment of vulnerable women, the systematic harvesting of human consciousness, the establishment of supernatural power networks, would be repeated again and again across the expanding American frontier. And somewhere, in dimensions beyond human perception, the scattered consciousness of 7 immortal predators waits patiently for the opportunity to return, to reconstitute their forms, and to resume their eternal harvest of human souls. The destruction of the Whitmore sisters should have marked the end of supernatural predation on the American frontier, but Dr. Morrison's investigation into the aftermath of the Millbrook incident would reveal that the sisters were not unique entities. They were part of a pattern that stretched back to the earliest days of human civilization and forward into a future that threatened the very survival of humanity itself. In the months following the collapse of the Whitmore homestead, Dr. Morrison's Department of Unusual Phenomena received reports from across the expanding United States that followed a disturbingly familiar pattern. Communities that had experienced unusual prosperity, followed by mysterious population decline. Towns where certain families never seemed to age while their neighbors suffered from premature death and disease. Settlements where beautiful women appeared suddenly and began offering miraculous solutions to local problems. Dr. Morrison realized that the Whitmore sisters had not been operating in isolation. They were part of a network of supernatural entities that had been systematically infiltrating and harvesting human communities for generations. The fonts of supernatural energy that powered their abilities were not random geological phenomena. They were strategic resources in a hidden war between humanity and forces that viewed human consciousness as nothing more than a renewable food source. The first major breakthrough in understanding the scope of this threat came from an unexpected source: the personal journal of Cotton Mather, the Puritan minister who had been instrumental in the Salem witch trials of 1692. Dr. Morrison's team discovered this journal hidden in the archives of Harvard University. Classified as a theological curiosity and largely ignored by mainstream historians, Mather's journal contained detailed descriptions of 7 women who had appeared in Salem shortly before the witch trial hysteria began. These women, according to Mather's carefully recorded observations, displayed the same characteristics as the Whitmore sisters: ageless beauty, supernatural abilities, and a tendency to appear wherever communities were facing their darkest hours. But Mather's account revealed something that Dr. Morrison's team had not previously understood. The Salem witch trials were not the result of religious hysteria or mass delusion. They were a desperate attempt by colonial authorities to combat a supernatural infestation that threatened to spread throughout the New World. The 7 women Mather described had arrived in Salem during the harsh winter of 1691, when the community was facing starvation and disease. They offered the same types of assistance that the Whitmore sisters would later provide in Tennessee: miraculous healing, supernatural knowledge of weather patterns and crop management, and the ability to solve problems that seemed beyond human capability. But Mather, unlike the residents of later communities, recognized the true nature of these entities. His theological training had exposed him to ancient texts that described similar supernatural predators in other parts of the world. He understood that the women were not blessed healers or wise counselors. They were parasitic entities that fed on human souls. Mather's journal described in meticulous detail how the 7 women systematically harvested the life force of Salem's residents. They began with the most vulnerable members of the community: the elderly, the sick, and the isolated. But as their appetite grew, they expanded their operations to include healthy adults and eventually even children. The witch trials, according to Mather's account, were a cover story designed to explain the supernatural events occurring in Salem without revealing the true nature of the threat. The women who were accused of witchcraft and executed were not supernatural entities. They were human residents of Salem who had been psychically compromised by the 7 predators. They had been turned into supernatural conduits, similar to Sarah Fletcher in the Whitmore case, and their executions were intended to sever the psychic connections that the entities were using to harvest human consciousness. But Mather's most disturbing revelation was this: the Salem operation had been successful only partially. While the authorities had managed to disrupt the 7 entities' harvesting operation and force them to abandon Salem, they had not been able to destroy the entities themselves. The 7 women had simply moved on to other communities, refining their techniques and becoming more sophisticated in their approach to human predation. Mather's journal included a map showing the locations where similar supernatural incidents had been reported throughout the colonial period. The pattern was unmistakable. A network of 7 woman covens was systematically working its way across the American colonies, establishing temporary harvesting operations and then moving on before colonial authorities could organize effective resistance. Dr. Morrison's team cross-referenced Mather's map with their own investigation into supernatural incidents throughout American history. What they discovered was a timeline of predation that spanned nearly 2 centuries and included some of the most famous mysterious disappearances and unexplained deaths in American folklore. The lost colony of Roanoke, which had disappeared without a trace in the late 1500s, showed clear signs of supernatural intervention. Archaeological evidence discovered by Dr. Morrison's team revealed that the colonists had not simply vanished. They had been systematically drained of life force over a period of months. The carved word Croatoan, found at the abandoned settlement, was not a reference to a nearby island. It was an ancient binding spell designed to contain supernatural entities. The Donner Party, the group of pioneers who had resorted to cannibalism while trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains during the winter of 1846-47, had been targeted by supernatural predators who had deliberately manipulated weather patterns to trap them in an isolated location. The cannibalism was not the result of simple starvation. It was the result of psychic manipulation designed to break down the survivors' psychological defenses and make them easier to harvest. Even the disappearance of the Franklin expedition in the Arctic in 1845 showed signs of supernatural intervention. While official records blamed the disaster on ice and harsh weather, Dr. Morrison's team discovered evidence that 7 women had been seen in Inuit villages near the expedition's last known location. These women, described by native witnesses as impossibly beautiful and apparently immune to the Arctic cold, had been asking detailed questions about the expedition's route and provisions. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was the pattern Dr. Morrison's team identified in the American Civil War. Analysis of casualty reports and battlefield accounts revealed that certain regiments had suffered disproportionately high losses, not from enemy action, but from mysterious diseases that drained the life force from otherwise healthy soldiers. These affected regiments had all been visited by groups of volunteer nurses, 7 women who appeared at field hospitals and offered their services to overwhelmed military medical personnel. These nurses were described as exceptionally skilled healers who could save soldiers from wounds that should have been fatal. But soldiers treated by these nurses often died within weeks of their recovery, succumbing to a wasting disease that left their bodies aged decades beyond their actual years. Dr. Morrison realized that the supernatural entities had recognized the Civil War as an unprecedented opportunity for mass harvesting. The chaos and destruction of warfare provided perfect cover for their operations, and the constant movement of military units allowed them to avoid detection by any single authority for long periods. The investigation revealed that multiple covens of 7 women had operated throughout the Civil War, attached to different armies and moving between various theaters of conflict. They had been responsible for thousands of unexplained deaths on both sides of the conflict, feeding on the life force of young soldiers who should have had decades of life ahead of them. But the Civil War had also marked a turning point in the entity's operations. The scale of the conflict had attracted the attention of government officials who were beginning to understand the supernatural threat facing the nation. The Department of Unusual Phenomena had been established in response to reports of impossible events occurring on Civil War battlefields, and its first mission had been to identify and combat supernatural threats to American military forces. Dr. Morrison's predecessor, Dr. Ezekiel Hartwell, had been the first to recognize the pattern of 7-woman covens and their harvesting operations. His preliminary research had laid the groundwork for the department's eventual confrontation with the Whitmore sisters in Tennessee. But Dr. Hartwell's investigation had been cut short when he was found dead in his office in 1867, apparently having aged decades overnight, the same signature that would later be associated with supernatural predation. Dr. Morrison realized that his own investigation was building on decades of classified research into supernatural threats that the government had been tracking since the mid-1800s. The Department of Unusual Phenomena had compiled extensive files on supernatural incidents throughout American history, and these files revealed a pattern of escalating supernatural activity that seemed to be building toward some kind of climax. The most disturbing pattern Dr. Morrison identified was the geographic distribution of supernatural incidents. The 7-woman covens were not operating randomly. They were systematically targeting communities located near geological formations that could serve as potential font sites. They were conducting a survey of supernatural resources across the American continent, identifying locations where new fonts could be established. Dr. Morrison's analysis suggested that the entities were working toward a long-term goal: the establishment of a permanent supernatural infrastructure that would allow them to harvest human consciousness on an industrial scale. The individual covens were essentially advanced scouts, mapping the continent's supernatural resources and preparing the way for a much larger operation. But the most terrifying discovery came when Dr. Morrison's team analyzed the timing of supernatural incidents over the past century. The frequency of supernatural predation was increasing exponentially. Events that had occurred once every few decades in the colonial period were now happening multiple times per year. The entities were becoming more aggressive, more sophisticated, and more numerous. Dr. Morrison realized that humanity was facing an exponential threat. If the current rate of increase continued, supernatural predation would become so common that it would be impossible to conceal from the general public. The careful balance of secrecy that had allowed the government to combat supernatural threats while maintaining social stability would collapse, leading to widespread panic and social breakdown. But the investigation also revealed that the entities were facing their own challenges. The increasing population density of the United States was making it more difficult for them to operate undetected. The development of new technologies, telegraph lines, railroad networks, and newspaper distribution was making it harder for them to isolate communities and prevent information about their activities from spreading. Most importantly, the entity's own success was working against them. The massive harvesting operations they had conducted during the Civil War had attracted the attention of government authorities who were now actively hunting them. For the first time in their centuries-long predation of humanity, the entities were facing organized, informed resistance. Dr. Morrison's team identified several factors that were forcing the entities to modify their traditional operating procedures. The establishment of federal law enforcement agencies meant that mysterious disappearances and unexplained deaths were more likely to be investigated by professional authorities rather than ignored by local communities. The development of medical science meant that the symptoms of supernatural predation were more likely to be recognized and documented, and the growth of urban populations meant that it was becoming increasingly difficult to find isolated communities that could be harvested without attracting outside attention. In response to these challenges, the entities appeared to be adapting their methods. Rather than establishing temporary harvesting operations in rural communities, they were beginning to integrate themselves into urban environments where their activities could be disguised as natural phenomena. Instead of appearing as mysterious healers or wise women, they were taking on modern identities: teachers, nurses, social workers, and other professionals who had legitimate access to vulnerable populations. Dr. Morrison's investigation into post-Civil War supernatural incidents revealed this new pattern clearly. In Chicago, 7 women working as volunteer nurses during the cholera epidemic of 1885 had been responsible for hundreds of deaths that were attributed to the disease, but actually resulted from supernatural predation. In San Francisco, 7 women operating a home for orphaned children had systematically harvested the life force of over 200 children between 1889 and 1894 before disappearing just days before a scheduled government inspection. The entities were becoming more sophisticated in their approach, but they were also becoming more desperate. The increasing difficulty of their operations was forcing them to take greater risks and harvest larger numbers of victims in shorter periods of time. This acceleration was making their activities more visible to government investigators, creating a dangerous cycle where increased detection led to increased desperation, which led to even more aggressive predation. Dr. Morrison realized that the supernatural war between humanity and these entities was entering a critical phase. The entities could not continue their traditional methods indefinitely, and humanity was developing the technological and institutional capabilities to mount effective resistance. Something would have to give, and soon. The breakthrough that would define the next phase of this hidden war came from an unexpected source. A young immigrant woman named Elena Vasquez, who had survived a supernatural predation attempt in New York City in 1889. Unlike most survivors of such encounters, Elena had retained clear memories of her experience and had been able to provide Dr. Morrison's team with detailed information about the entity's current operating procedures. Elena had been working as a seamstress in a garment factory when 7 women appeared at her workplace, claiming to be representatives of a charitable organization dedicated to improving working conditions for immigrant women. They offered Elena and her co-workers free medical care, English language lessons, and assistance with legal problems related to their immigration status. The 7 women, who called themselves the Sisters of Mercy, established a settlement house in Elena's neighborhood and began providing various forms of assistance to the local immigrant community. They were particularly effective at helping women who were struggling with poverty, domestic violence, or immigration difficulties. Their intervention often resulted in dramatic improvements in their clients' circumstances, and they quickly gained a reputation as miraculous helpers who could solve any problem. But Elena noticed that the women who received the most help from the Sisters of Mercy began to change in subtle ways. They became more compliant, less independent, and increasingly dependent on the sisters' guidance. They would spend hours at the settlement house, participating in meditation sessions and spiritual counseling that left them in a trance-like state. And gradually, they began to age rapidly while maintaining an artificial sense of contentment and well-being. Elena's breakthrough came when she realized that the Sisters of Mercy were using modern social welfare systems as a cover for their traditional harvesting operations. They were identifying vulnerable women through legitimate charitable work, gaining their trust through genuine assistance, and then gradually transitioning them into supernatural parasitism. The urban environment provided them with a steady stream of isolated, desperate women who could be harvested without attracting attention from their families or communities. But Elena also discovered something that gave her hope. The entities' adaptation to modern conditions had created new vulnerabilities. Their integration into urban social systems meant that they had to maintain consistent identities and regular schedules. They could be tracked, monitored, and potentially confronted in ways that had not been possible when they operated as mysterious wanderers in rural communities. Elena's information allowed Dr. Morrison's team to locate and observe the Sisters of Mercy's operation in New York. What they discovered confirmed their worst fears about the entities: evolution. The 7 women had established a permanent harvesting operation that was capable of processing hundreds of victims simultaneously, while maintaining complete invisibility to conventional authorities. The Sisters of Mercy had created a network of charitable organizations, medical clinics, and educational institutions that served as fronts for their supernatural predation. They were harvesting life force from immigrant women, factory workers, domestic servants, and other vulnerable populations who were unlikely to be missed by mainstream society. And they were doing it all while maintaining impeccable public reputations as humanitarian reformers. But Dr. Morrison's surveillance also revealed that the Sisters of Mercy were not operating in isolation. They were in communication with other supernatural entities throughout the United States, coordinating their activities and sharing information about successful harvesting techniques. The 7-woman covens that had once operated independently were now functioning as part of a unified network with centralized leadership and strategic coordination. Dr. Morrison realized that humanity was facing a new phase of the supernatural war: organized, systematic predation by entities that had adapted to modern conditions and were no longer constrained by the limitations that had previously kept their activities relatively small scale. The age of isolated supernatural incidents was ending, and the age of systematic supernatural exploitation was beginning. The question that haunted Dr. Morrison as he prepared his team for what he knew would be the most dangerous mission in the department's history was this: if the entities were adapting and evolving their methods so rapidly, what would they become next? And would humanity be able to adapt quickly enough to survive the escalating supernatural war that was about to engulf the modern world? The answer would come sooner than he expected, and from a source that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the nature of supernatural predation and the future of human civilization itself. In 1893, as Dr. Morrison's team prepared to assault the Sisters of Mercy's operation in New York, they received an urgent communication from a government agent working undercover in Chicago. The agent reported that 7 women matching the entity's profile had been seen at the World's Columbian Exposition, the massive World's Fair that was attracting millions of visitors from around the globe. But these women were not operating a small-scale harvesting operation targeting local residents. They were attempting something unprecedented in the history of supernatural predation: the mass harvesting of human consciousness from millions of visitors to the exposition. If they succeeded, they would gain access to enough psychic energy to establish permanent fonts in every major city in the United States, creating a supernatural infrastructure that would allow them to harvest the entire American population. Dr. Morrison realized that the Chicago Exposition represented both the greatest threat and the greatest opportunity in the history of the supernatural war. If the entities succeeded in their mass harvesting operation, humanity would lose any chance of resisting supernatural predation. But if Dr. Morrison's team could stop them at the exposition, they might be able to deliver a blow that would cripple the entities operations for generations. The battle for the future of human civilization was about to begin in the gleaming exhibition halls of the world's Columbian Exposition, where the technological marvels of the modern age would clash with supernatural forces older than recorded history, and the outcome would determine whether humanity would enter the 20th century as masters of their own destiny or as livestock in a supernatural feeding operation that spanned the globe. As Dr. Morrison and his team boarded the train to Chicago, they carried with them the hopes of a species that didn't even know it was at war. The age of individual heroism and isolated supernatural incidents was ending. The age of total war between humanity and forces beyond human comprehension was about to begin, but they also carried something else. The knowledge that human beings, when faced with extinction, were capable of extraordinary courage, sacrifice, and ingenuity. The memory of Lieutenant Marcus Webb's sacrifice at the Whitmore homestead, of Sarah Fletcher's choice to die human rather than live as a supernatural parasite, and of countless other forgotten heroes who had given their lives to protect humanity from supernatural predation. The entities had adapted to the modern world, but so had humanity, and the battle that was about to unfold in Chicago would test whether human adaptation could match supernatural evolution in the ultimate struggle for the future of conscious life on Earth. The train carrying Dr. Morrison and his team toward Chicago moved through the American landscape, like an arrow aimed at the heart of a supernatural conspiracy that had been centuries in the making. Behind them lay the scattered graves of supernatural predation's victims. Ahead lay either humanity's greatest victory or its final defeat. The World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 was intended to showcase human achievement and technological progress. Instead, it would become the battlefield where the fate of human consciousness itself would be decided, where the hidden war between humanity and supernatural predation would finally emerge from the shadows into the light of public revelation. And somewhere in the gleaming exhibition halls of the White City, 7 ageless women were preparing to harvest the minds of millions, unaware that for the first time in their centuries-long predation of humanity, their victims were ready to fight back with weapons forged from human courage, scientific knowledge, and the desperate determination of a species that refused to go quietly into the darkness of supernatural servitude. The final phase of the supernatural war was about to begin, and the outcome would echo through history into the modern day, where the descendants of both predators and protectors continue their eternal struggle in forms that the 19th century could never have imagined, but which carry the same fundamental stakes: the right of human consciousness to exist free from supernatural exploitation. The World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 was meant to be humanity's greatest celebration of progress and achievement. Instead, it became the stage for the most decisive battle in the hidden war between human civilization and supernatural predation. What Dr. Morrison and his team discovered in the gleaming pavilions of the White City would forever change humanity's understanding of the forces that shaped its destiny, and reveal that the threat they faced was far more sophisticated and far-reaching than they had ever imagined. The 7 entities operating at the exposition were not the same primitive predators that had terrorized frontier communities for centuries. These were evolved supernatural beings who had learned to harness the power of mass communication, modern transportation, and industrial technology to amplify their harvesting capabilities beyond anything previously conceived. They had transformed from individual predators into a coordinated intelligence that threatened to consume human consciousness on a global scale. Dr. Morrison's team discovered that the entities had been planning the exposition operation for decades, carefully positioning themselves within the organizations responsible for planning and executing the World's Fair. They had influenced the selection of exhibits, the design of buildings, and even the scheduling of events to create optimal conditions for mass psychic harvesting. The exposition wasn't just hosting supernatural predators, it had been designed by them as the ultimate harvesting machine. The entity's plan was diabolically sophisticated. They had embedded psychic resonance devices throughout the exposition grounds, disguised as decorative elements and technological displays. These devices were designed to gradually synchronize the brainwave patterns of visitors, creating a massive collective consciousness that could be harvested all at once. The millions of people who visited the exposition would leave with their memories intact but their essential life force drained, creating a generation of psychic zombies who would live out their remaining years in a state of diminished vitality. But the most horrifying discovery was that the exposition operation was merely a test run for something far more ambitious. The entities had been studying human social organization and technological development for decades, learning how to exploit the systems that held modern civilization together. They were planning to replicate the exposition model in every major city in the world, creating a global network of harvesting operations that would systematically drain the life force from the entire human species. Dr. Morrison realized that humanity was facing an extinction-level threat that had been centuries in the making. The entities were not simply predators. They were a hostile intelligence that had been systematically studying and infiltrating human civilization with the ultimate goal of transforming humanity into a domesticated food source. The isolated supernatural incidents of the past had been reconnaissance missions, gathering intelligence for a final assault on human consciousness itself. The battle that erupted in the Exposition's Hall of Electricity on the night of October 13, 1893, was unlike anything in recorded history. Dr. Morrison's team, armed with weapons forged from meteoric iron and electromagnetic devices capable of disrupting psychic energy, faced 7 entities who had evolved far beyond their original forms. These were no longer women who had gained immortality through ancient pacts. They were pure supernatural intelligence that had learned to manipulate matter, energy, and consciousness itself. The entities had transformed the Hall of Electricity into a massive psychic amplification chamber, using the exposition's electrical systems to broadcast their influence to every visitor on the grounds. Millions of people were moving through the exposition in a trance-like state, their consciousness slowly being drained and channeled into the entities' collective intelligence. The very technology that was meant to represent human achievement had been turned into a weapon against human autonomy. Dr. Morrison's assault team faced a terrifying realization. Conventional weapons were useless against entities that existed partially outside of physical reality. The meteoric iron bullets that had wounded the Whitmore sisters barely affected these evolved predators. The electromagnetic devices that had disrupted localized supernatural phenomena were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of psychic energy the entities were manipulating. But Dr. Morrison had one advantage that the entities had not anticipated: the accumulated knowledge of centuries of human resistance to supernatural predation. Hidden in the classified archives of the Department of Unusual Phenomena were accounts of previous battles against supernatural entities, including detailed descriptions of their vulnerabilities and the specific conditions required to defeat them permanently. The key insight came from Dr. Morrison's analysis of the Salem witch trials and Cotton Mather's journal. Mather had discovered that supernatural entities drew their power from the collective belief and fear of their victims. The more people believed in their power, the stronger they became. But this dependence on human belief was also their greatest weakness. If enough people simultaneously rejected their influence, their power would collapse. Dr. Morrison realized that the entities planned to harvest millions of people simultaneously created an unprecedented opportunity. If his team could break the psychic synchronization they had established over the exposition crowds, the sudden disconnection of millions of minds would create a feedback effect that could destroy the entities permanently. The solution required a desperate gambit. Dr. Morrison's team would have to override the exposition's electrical systems and use them to broadcast a counter-signal that would disrupt the entity's psychic control. But someone would have to maintain the broadcast manually from inside the Hall of Electricity, exposing themselves to the full fury of 7 evolved supernatural predators who would be fighting for their existence. Dr. Morrison made the choice that would define the remainder of his life. He ordered his team to evacuate the building and prepared to make the same sacrifice that Lieutenant Marcus Webb had made at the Whitmore homestead. But as he began the process of overriding the electrical systems, he was joined by an unexpected ally, Elena Vasquez, the young immigrant woman who had survived the Sisters of Mercy's predation attempt in New York. Elena had traveled to Chicago with information that would prove crucial to the battle's outcome. During her captivity by the Sisters of Mercy, she had learned that the entities were not invulnerable to human consciousness. They were vulnerable to specific types of human emotional and spiritual energy that they could not process or absorb: love, sacrifice, and genuine compassion created psychic frequencies that interfered with their harvesting operations. Elena and Dr. Morrison, working together in the heart of the entity's power, began broadcasting not just an electromagnetic countersignal, but something far more powerful, a psychic message of human resilience, courage, and refusal to submit to supernatural predation. The signal carried the combined emotional energy of every human being who had ever resisted supernatural oppression, from the victims of the Salem witch trials to the residents of Millbrook who had fought to maintain their humanity in the face of impossible odds. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Across the exposition grounds, millions of visitors suddenly awoke from their trance-like state and began to understand what was happening to them. The collective realization that they were being harvested by supernatural predators created a massive wave of rejection and resistance that overwhelmed the entity's psychic defenses. The 7 entities, caught in the feedback loop of millions of minds simultaneously rejecting their influence, began to lose coherence. Their evolved forms collapsed back into more primitive configurations, and then began to disintegrate entirely as the psychic energy they had accumulated over centuries was turned against them by the very consciousness they had sought to consume. But the entity's destruction came at a terrible cost. The psychic explosion that resulted from their dissolution destroyed most of the exposition's electrical systems and caused massive fires throughout the White City. Elena Vasquez was killed instantly by the psychic backlash, her consciousness burned away by the enormous energies she had helped to channel. Dr. Morrison survived, but was forever changed by his exposure to supernatural forces beyond human comprehension. The official record of the exposition fire blamed faulty electrical wiring and poor safety precautions. The truth, that humanity had just fought and won the most important battle in its history, was classified at the highest levels of government and buried in archives that officially do not exist. But the victory was real, and its effects would resonate through history for generations to come. The destruction of the evolved entities at the Chicago Exposition marked the end of organized supernatural predation as a threat to human civilization. The network of 7 woman covens that had terrorized communities for centuries was broken, their coordinating intelligence destroyed, their accumulated knowledge and power dissipated. For the first time in recorded history, humanity had achieved a decisive victory against supernatural forces that sought to enslave the human species. But Dr. Morrison's investigation into the aftermath of the exposition battle would reveal that the victory, while real, was not permanent. Supernatural predation was not eliminated. It was forced to evolve once again, adapting to a world where organized resistance to supernatural threats had become institutionalized and where human consciousness had developed new defenses against psychic manipulation. The 20th century saw the emergence of a new pattern of supernatural activity. Instead of the large-scale harvesting operations that had characterized the previous era, supernatural entities began operating as isolated individuals, working within existing social and economic systems to slowly drain life force from small numbers of victims over extended periods of time. These modern supernatural predators learned to disguise their activities as natural phenomena, depression, anxiety, chronic fatigue, and other conditions that could be explained by conventional psychology and medicine. They embedded themselves in urban environments as therapists, social workers, medical professionals, and spiritual advisors, positions that gave them access to vulnerable people while providing cover for their predatory activities. Dr. Morrison's successors at the Department of Unusual Phenomena tracked these new patterns throughout the 20th century, documenting cases where individuals reported feeling drained, aged, and psychologically diminished after contact with certain professionals or spiritual advisors. But the new generation of supernatural predators was far more subtle than their predecessors, making their activities almost impossible to distinguish from the normal stress and psychological challenges of modern life. The pattern became clear during the mental health crisis of the 1960s and 1970s, when reports of unexplained psychological exhaustion and premature aging began to spike in major urban centers. Government investigators discovered that certain alternative therapy practitioners, spiritual gurus, and self-help professionals were showing the same characteristics that had once identified supernatural predators: ageless appearance, uncanny insights into their clients, psychological vulnerabilities, and a tendency to leave their clients worse off than they had found them. But the most disturbing development was the discovery that some of these modern predators were not supernatural entities at all. They were human beings who had learned to replicate supernatural harvesting techniques using a combination of advanced psychology, pharmaceutical intervention, and technology. The knowledge that had once been the exclusive domain of immortal supernatural entities was being systematically reverse-engineered and weaponized by purely human agents. Dr. Morrison's files, declassified in 1995 under the Freedom of Information Act but heavily redacted, reveal that government investigators have been tracking suspected supernatural predation cases into the 21st century. The modern pattern involves individuals who establish themselves as successful entrepreneurs, motivational speakers, or wellness professionals, building large followings of devoted clients who provide them with a steady source of psychic energy to harvest. These modern predators have learned to use social media, online communities, and digital marketing to identify and target vulnerable individuals on a scale that the supernatural entities of previous centuries could never have achieved. They can harvest life force from thousands of victims simultaneously without ever meeting them in person, using sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques delivered through carefully crafted online content. The most chilling aspect of this modern evolution is that it represents a hybrid threat. Supernatural techniques being used by human agents who may or may not be aware of the true nature of their activities. Some appear to be conscious predators who have learned to exploit supernatural principles for personal gain. Others seem to be unwitting conduits for forces they don't understand. Individuals whose natural charisma and psychological insight have been enhanced by exposure to supernatural energies. Government agencies continue to monitor this threat through programs that officially do not exist, tracking patterns of unexplained psychological exhaustion, premature aging, and spiritual manipulation in populations exposed to certain types of motivational and wellness content. The challenge for modern investigators is distinguishing between legitimate self-help professionals and those who are either consciously or unconsciously engaged in psychic predation. The legacy of the Whitmore sisters and their supernatural network lives on in forms that the 19th century investigators could never have imagined. The ancient hunger for human consciousness has learned to exploit modern technology, social media, and the wellness industry to continue its eternal harvest in ways that are almost impossible to detect or resist. But the legacy of human resistance also continues. The Department of Unusual Phenomena, now operating under different names and classifications, maintains programs designed to identify and counter supernatural threats to human consciousness. The knowledge gained from centuries of supernatural warfare has been codified into training programs for law enforcement, mental health professionals, and educators who need to recognize the signs of supernatural predation. Most importantly, the principles that Dr. Morrison and Elena Vasquez used to defeat the entities at the Chicago Exposition, human courage, collective resistance, and the power of conscious rejection of supernatural manipulation, remain effective against modern predators. The key to resistance is awareness. Understanding that supernatural predation is real, recognizing its modern manifestations, and refusing to submit to influences that seek to diminish human consciousness and autonomy. The battle that began in the Tennessee mountains with 7 ageless sisters continues today in forms that span the globe and exploit every aspect of modern technology and social organization. The entities have evolved, but so has humanity's capacity to resist them. The war for human consciousness is not a historical curiosity. It is an ongoing conflict that shapes the modern world in ways that most people never recognize. The investigation into the Whitmore sisters and their supernatural network reveals a truth that challenges everything we think we know about human history and the forces that shape our daily lives. We are not alone in our consciousness, and we never have been. There are entities, both supernatural and human, that view our minds as resources to be harvested, our emotions as energy to be consumed, and our spiritual development as a threat to be suppressed. But the investigation also reveals something else: human consciousness. When fully awakened and collectively focused, is more powerful than any predator that seeks to exploit it. The courage of individuals like Dr. Morrison, Elena Vasquez, Sarah Fletcher, and Lieutenant Marcus Webb demonstrates that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary threats, are capable of extraordinary resistance. The story of the seven sisters who never aged is not just a historical mystery. It is a guide to understanding the hidden forces that continue to shape our world and our minds. It is a reminder that the price of consciousness is eternal vigilance, and that the battle for human autonomy is never truly won, only continuously fought by each generation that chooses to remain awake rather than submit to the comfortable sleep of unconscious consumption. The ancient pact that cursed seven sisters to never die has been broken, but the hunger that drove them to make that pact remains. It has adapted, evolved, and learned to exploit the very systems we created to protect ourselves from it. The question that faces us now is the same one that faced Dr. Morrison and his team in the flickering electrical displays of the Chicago Exposition. Will we recognize the threat to our consciousness in time to resist it? Or will we sleepwalk into a future where human autonomy becomes nothing more than a historical curiosity, preserved in classified files that officially do not exist? The answer depends on our willingness to face uncomfortable truths about the nature of reality and our place in it. The investigation is over, but the choice remains ours to make. So what's your take on all of this? Do you believe that supernatural predation is an ongoing threat that has simply adapted to modern conditions? Or do you think these historical accounts represent a phenomenon that has been permanently defeated? Are the patterns we see in modern wellness culture and social media manipulation evidence of evolved supernatural predation, or are they simply the result of human greed and psychological manipulation? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and your insights help shape our future investigations. If you found this investigation into the hidden history of supernatural predation compelling, make sure to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We dig deep into the classified files and forgotten archives to bring you the stories that powerful forces don't want you to know. There are more secrets waiting to be uncovered, more patterns waiting to be recognized, and more truths waiting to be revealed. And if you think others need to know about the hidden war for human consciousness that has been raging for centuries, share this investigation with them. Help us spread awareness about the forces that seek to exploit human consciousness and the principles that can be used to resist them. Knowledge is the most powerful weapon against predation of any kind, and sharing that knowledge is the most important thing any of us can do to protect human autonomy in an age of unprecedented manipulation. The investigation into the ancient pact that cursed seven sisters to never die reveals that the real curse was never immortality. It was the hunger that made immortality seem necessary, and that hunger in various forms continues to threaten human consciousness in ways that demand our constant awareness and resistance.